This is probably the first time that Judi has spoken in front of a live audience. She's been on radio many times and interviewed. She prefers to be interviewed. And she told me on the phone a couple of months ago when I told her that Dr. Weintraub and his wife and DMK would sponsor this, that she was scared to death. And thank God for the new hemlines to go over the knees, because when you notice her knees were knocking. And I said she'll be great because she's an extremely intelligent woman and she addresses everything with absolutely scientific perfection. So without further ado, please welcome for this evening's seminar, Judi Smith.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you coming out on a Saturday night. I truly do. It's very kind
Can't
of you.
hear you.
Is there any?
They didn't function for some reason.
Well, I'm sorry. I was at the clinic all day yesterday talking, and so my voice is a little weak today, but I will try. Please holler at me in the back if you can't hear. In any case, please forgive me too if I refer to it as an anti-aging treatment, because I'm used to doing that, but I fully accept what Danae says. So when I say anti-aging, you hear age management. Well, be good. But anyway, thank you so much, and thank you for all the friends I see that came out tonight who've heard all of this a million times. I so appreciate it. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here because I have so many people who've been to the clinic. But anyway, what we do at the International Clinic of Biological Regeneration, ICBR, the only treatment we do is cell therapy, CELL. Not to be confused with stem cells, which I'll try to explain the difference a little bit later. This is a treatment that really predates that by quite a bit. It started, let me explain what it is, first of all, just in simple terms. It is the injection of embryonic and fetal tissue. The purpose is rejuvenation and regeneration. It is a general age management, we'll get used to that, treatment. It is not a treatment for a specific degree.
I have to apologize. We had a mic, but we don't have a 9-volt battery and the battery's dead. So is there any way you can stand up like over?
I can do
There's
that.
a lot of people that have come back.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah, that's better.
Better? Okay. So I'll. This is good. This is good. You're going to be holding your ears there, because I'll be yelling at you. So to repeat, what it is the injection of embryonic and fetal cells. The purpose is general rejuvenation or regeneration. It is not a specific treatment for disease. Danae has referred to some wonderful results we've gotten, and I feel blessed when that happens, because there's a lot of crossover with aging and with degenerative disease. So it is applicable to things that happen in life, particularly as they result from failures in the immune system or the endocrine system, which are the things that cell therapy primarily addresses. So basically, let me give you a little background on what it is for those of you. I'll start at the beginning for people who are not familiar with it at all. Cell therapy was developed in the 30s. The research really predated that, but there was a Dr. Paul Nahans, which you may have heard the word, because there are cosmetics from Clinic Lockery, and that is Dr. Nahans, a continuation of his practice. But he began in the 30s and 40s doing research, as I say, building on some predated research that showed that the injection of animal tissue could rejuvenate our organs. It goes back as far back as eating a lion's heart for bravery. I mean, there is this like cures like philosophy. But there was a lot of research that did show that if you used young embryonic tissue, that you did set up a regeneration in the corresponding tissues in people. So his research was ongoing, but he was a general practicing MD, and it so happened he had a case in the hospital, or was called in on a case of a woman who had had a thyroidectomy, and her parathyroids had been inadvertently damaged or removed, which resulted in catastrophic muscle failure. That's what controls your muscle contraction. And so she was dying. Her breathing capacity was diminished. She was going to lose her ability to swallow. It was a fatal thing. So he was called in to see if he had anything to offer, and he, building on his research, did the crudest thing you can imagine, went literally to a slaughterhouse, got a young calf, macerated the parathyroid glands, took them back to the hospital, couldn't have been less sterile, and injected them directly, into her pectoral muscles. So be it, in those days, I guess there's no malpractice, you live or die, and, he did the best he could. Well, she did survive, and she did regain her function. She lived into her 90s. They were friends for life, outlived him, as a matter of fact. And that was the beginning of clinical cell therapy. So with that success behind him, that really wasn't what he had in mind, was that he really looked at it as an anti-aging, age management therapy. And so in the 40s and 50s, he broadened that to that aspect of cell therapy. And he became very, very well known for treating some of the post-World War II dignitaries and statesmen from World War II. The Pope Pius XII, was a patient. That really put him on the map. So he opened Clinic La Prairie, which was the first cell therapy clinic. So basically, the idea is to use tissue of a young embryonic or fetal animal and to inject them. And in those days, it was called live cells because it actually was taken in a semi-surgical procedure from the embryonic animal and injected into the patient within 60 to 90 minutes to preserve the live cells. Well, what really happens after about 60 minutes is they deteriorate too much for injection. So that's why it had to be done so quickly. It was an effective treatment, and he certainly got a reputation for the results he was getting. It also had some danger involved, as you can imagine. Anytime you're injecting whole cells, literally a macerated organ, you're going to have extracellular material, you're going to have foreign protein. So they had to be kept, it was quite a procedure. It was semi-surgical, they had to be kept in-house for 3 to 5 days at least, and that's if things went well. There would be a slight fever. They would, in many cases, develop deep muscle abscess or, in worst case, anaphylactic shock. So there was a downside, but it was so popular because it was so effective that people, flocked to him. Extremely expensive. These were just very, very wealthy people who could afford such a thing. Well, it did expand beyond that. By the time we entered the field, and I'll give you a little background, I've had cell therapy clinics since 1981. My late husband, so that the math makes sense, I'll tell you up front, was older than I. He was 27 years older than I, so the things that, that happened in the 50s, I wasn't part of. But he was a medical student in the 50s, and he was in a very severe radiation accident. He was the head resident of a X-ray department in a Salvation Army clinic. They were using hand-me-down equipment, and I guess OSHA didn't, exist in those days. There were no real safeguards on these things. And they had a bulky X-ray machine that other students came to him and said, it's not firing again. So he took them at their word, and he went in to work on it, stood right in front of it for about 10 minutes, fooling with it with a coin out of his pocket, only to find out it had been on the whole time. There was a filter over the light. And long story short, he had a severe radiation damage to his thyroid, which they considered fatal. So, his own profession only had palliative things to offer. Some drugs to calm down the thyroid storms. They wanted to drill a hole in his head to relieve the pressure, but all these things were just to make his life livable to the end. Well, he wasn't willing to accept that. So he had taken a nutrition class in those days. Anybody here remembers Adele Davis? I remember we talk about showing your age, but anyway, he had taken a nutrition class under a protege of Adele Davis who was just on fire with this subject. And he listened, he really was intrigued. Called on that, what he had learned from her, and that began his path of alternative medicine. He studied survivors of Hiroshima and why people in close proximity, one would die and one would survive. And he found that they had a very high intake of kelp, which, later iodine was, isolated. And now we know that potassium iodide would be the protection from the thyroid for radiation. But he started taking an enormous amount of kelp. A haphazard nutrition program. There was nothing he could grab onto. He just tried. He did survive, obviously, beyond the expectations and lived another 50 years. Devoted that time to the pursuit of alternative medicine and was not licensed in, but studied naturopathy, chiropractic, acupuncture. Homeopathy was his love. He devoted a great deal of time to homeopathy. And ultimately came upon a practitioner friend of his in London who was practicing cell therapy. We didn't know much, I didn't know anything about it. He knew of it, and he was at the University of London taking a postgraduate course in nutrition, and he started spending his evenings with Dr. Peter Steffen, who was, his father had been a contemporary of Paul Nahman's, and he was continuing his dad's practice. So he ended up spending evenings and interning with Dr. Steffen and became very intrigued with cell therapy. We worked for a very short time with another clinic called Swiss International Clinics. They were doing a variation of cell therapy, but he was not one to be happy with how do I do this and then start giving people injections, you know. He wanted to understand the academic end of it. So he attended in 1983 and 84 the University of Vienna, which is the seat of most of the academic work in cell therapy, and really became acquainted with how it's done and the real research behind it. We developed a protocol from that that was slightly different than what was being done in the other clinics, but the most important thing to come out of it was his understanding of the price structure. You know, because the clinics in Europe, and continue to this day, to be tens of thousands of dollars. It's very expensive. But they cater to a clientele that is recognizable, a lot of celebrities, a lot of, statesmen from various countries, and they need and deserve their privacy, you know, as much as anyone else, their medical privacy. So that necessitated private chauffeurs and private rooms and private staff. And of course, the ambiance, they were in castles. I mean, literally, the surroundings were plush. But when he studied at the University of Vienna and they were doing the actual studies, he learned about the pharmaceutical end of it. And I recall very well the day he said, this does not need to be tens of thousands of dollars. It's a relatively expensive treatment. But, you know, if you strip away the things that aren't necessary and you devote it to the pharmacy itself, it could come down to a price range that, you know, folks could afford, that regular people could afford. So he came up with the idea of bringing it back to the borders of the United States, not into resort areas in, say, Mexico or the Caribbean, but someplace accessible to people that they could drive to, not own our own building and try to maintain it, but work on a per diem basis on existing clinics. Use the staff as available, in other words, trim it down as much as we could. And that's exactly what we did. So our mission statement from the beginning was to provide cell therapy at a cost that was reasonable. So that's what we've done, and we've been doing it ever since. As I said, it started in 1981. It was not an easy practice to build, thanks to friends. Danae did this for us previously, getting groups together, explaining what it is. He had people who really put a lot of faith in him, who would say, I'll do it, but you're going to take sheep cells and do what? You know, why? You know, so he had to really build this story and make people understand what it is. So that is basically what we do. It is the injection of these embryonic and fetal cells. Now, we've developed a protocol over the years. There are fundamental things that affect us as we age, and that is a decline in the connective tissue, a decline, which is what makes us look older, a decline in the immune system and the endocrine systems. And those are the things that, you know, that's Mother Nature's way of taking us out. But ultimately, those systems fail. We become open to infection or serious disease. And, you know, that is our demise if we haven't met it already. So what we're trying to do is to keep those systems vital, to stay as young as you can, look as good as you can, as long as you can. It's not a panacea, it is not a miracle, and it's not a mystery. It is simply a good treatment that, taken with exercise and a good diet, it's not an antidote for a bad lifestyle, will help to prolong, you know, youth and vitality. So what we're working with primarily, as I mentioned, we're always working with those systems. There is one serum that's called Omnigen, and that is an overall cellular therapy, whole embryo treatment. We treat with the entire endocrine system. I want to talk about that a little bit because that's very, very important. Those are the things that tend to fail with age, and that is a biofeedback system within. You can't, you know, we can have a diabetic patient, for instance, and we will concentrate on pancreatic cells. But the point is, it's a feedback. It's not, you're not a patient, you know, with just a pancreas that's malfunctioning. You have an entire endocrine system that's affected by that. So we work entirely with systems when we're treating endocrine problems. And then within that system, and this is a change that something that we've included just recently, there is an axis within the endocrine system called the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. This is fundamental to anti-inflammatory and your immune function. And the adrenals that we're finding across the board, I mean, people are just, their adrenal glands are either exhausted or nearly so. And it comes both from the stress of your life, because everybody's got it, one kind or another, and I can't do anything about that, or it comes from the unseen stresses in life, like the environment, the background radiation. We have no idea what being in a Wi-Fi situation does to us all the time. So this is taking a toll on your endocrine system. So we treat into those things very carefully. We also treat into the immune system, because this is something that also will fail with age. So the cell therapy approach that we use is an overall approach to the systems that have most to do with aging, have most to do with chronic disease. And then we get specific, which is why we'll ask, what's the nature of your problem? Everyone has a family history, or they have a current problem, or they have a weakness or a tendency, and we can treat into that. So when Danae mentioned that he came and he said, I need more brain cells. Well, this isn't uncommon. That's one of the most common things I hear is that, and it's not pathological. It's not the Alzheimer's confusion. I mean, there is a difference between cognitive decline that we experience with age as a natural process and a disease state such as Alzheimer's, and we would approach them a little bit differently. But this is very common. But a lot of it has to do with not a decline in brain function or any kind of pathology in the brain. It has to do with your endocrine system. So any woman who's of age knows what the fog of menopause means. I mean, all of a sudden you suddenly look up a phone number and you can't remember it long enough to dial it, and you just think, what's that? Okay, that is an endocrine decline, not a decline in brain function. So that is why we take the overall approach of treating the whole body, the whole system, and then we get specific. Because if you try to get too smart and say, oh, I know that's part of the brain that has to do with memory, we'll just give those cells, you'll miss the boat. So that is the basis of what we do. These cells actually are produced from black mountain sheep, and this is something that goes back to Paul Nahan's days. In his early days, they were actually using food source animals. So the reason black mountain sheep were chosen is that they're very hardy animals. They're very easy to keep well. They have a very strong immune system. You can't really even graft cancer into them because they have such a strong immune system that they will fight it off. So they were chosen for that reason, and they continue to be used for that reason. But they are now pharmaceutically raised. They are not farm animals. They are prized animals of the pharmaceutical industry. And all of that now is very scientifically done and produced in the laboratories, which is where we get our cells. So that is basically what it is. And we've been doing this for 30 years. We have 3 clinics. They're in Nassau, Bahamas. We have 2 in Mexico, a very small office in Matamoros, Mexico, which is south of Brownsville, Texas. We've had that for years. And then in 2007, we moved out to Tijuana because there's so much of a demand from the California folks. Because you're all more familiar with it than anyone else. Because of Hollywood. I mean, there's been a lot of talk of it here that people, were familiar with it. Just glad that it was now more affordable. So basically, that is, what it is. As far as the delivery system, what we normally do is, and if you're interested, let me mention, there's a guest book at the back. If you'd like some printed material, you're more than welcome to give me your name, address, email if you'd like, but postal address, please, and I'll mail that to you. Give me your take one of my cards, or I ran short because I gave so many of them away, but I do have some printed, hand-printed cards back there with my email address, and if you'd like more information on this, please do email me and let me know, and I'll be glad to send that to you. Or feel free to call me, because people have questions, and don't think it's any kind of a commitment if you call me. It's just be glad to talk with you. It's not a problem. So I don't know exactly what anyone knows about cell therapy or what you might like to know about it. If you have any questions, you'll feel free to ask them, during the course of this. It's not a problem at all.
What about inflammation?
Okay, that is the biggest thing. I think the root of most problems comes down, that we're seeing now in the population, comes down to autoimmune problems and inflammation. Those are the things that, affect, everything is coming down to an autoimmune problem. Every time you hear about, we used to see rheumatoid arthritis. We used to see the occasional scleroderma. Now I don't think I see a group of 20 people that I don't see a Hashimoto's patient. Anybody that's not familiar, that is your own immune system turning on your thyroid gland and destroying it. Because of the problem I mentioned within that cycle of the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal, The problem is when there's there's an infectious agent, someone has the flu in your proximity, somebody sneezes in your face, you are supposed to have a slight inflammation response, supposed to have a slight immune response until the danger is past. It's the adrenals' job to turn that off, to bring everything back to homeostasis. Because the adrenals are so exhausted, that's not happening. And so that cycle just keeps ginning and ginning and ginning. And we're seeing two things as a result of that. You see hyperimmune response, and then ultimately immune deficiency when it burns itself out. And on the flip side, you see hyperinflammation. From the inflammation side, you see an increase in heart disease, arthritis, all the things, the inflammatory diseases. From the other side of the coin, we're seeing a tremendous increase in autoimmune diseases. This is just not normal for the immune system to be turning on healthy tissue in such a large percentage of the population. So there is a reason for this. I suspect it's environmental. I cannot take away the stress in your life. I cannot take away the background radiation. I wish I could, but I can at least support the glands that have to deal with that. So essentially that's what we're dealing with cell therapy. It is not a treatment for disease. It is a treatment to stimulate healthy tissue. So let me explain a little bit about how we think this works, what they know about how it works, and how theoretically it works. When these cells are injected, let me start about what they are. These are not, what they're not, probably is a better way to say it. These are not stem cells. I don't want to mislead or confuse anyone. Stem cells are completely without identity. They're the earliest embryonic cells. And stem cells are rapid growth. This is why stem cell therapy is going to be such a miracle. They're going to be able to use it for things like Parkinson's disease, diabetes. The most exciting, as far as I'm concerned, is spinal cord injuries. You're going to take someone paralyzed in an accident, get them to the hospital just like you would a broken bone. They're going to inject the stem cells, heal that site of injury, and have them recover. Really exciting things with stem cells. But they will be used for specific things. The stem cell has no identity. It has to be surgically put where you want it, whether that is a site of injury or a site of disease. If it's a spinal cord injury, it has to be surgically implanted at the area site of injury. It is a specific treatment for a specific condition. Cell therapy is a more general treatment. We're using cells that are of a more mature nature. So if you kind of think back to your 9th grade biology where you understand that all mammalian cells are the same at a point of gestation, and then they start to differentiate. Well, they start to differentiate first by organ, then by species, and then ultimately by individual. So these are cells that are taken at a point that they're called organ-specific. If you put heart cells in a petri dish, they will start to come together and start to pump in a rhythm. They have an affinity for one another. So when we inject these cells that are organ-specific into a large muscle mass, and this is an intramuscular treatment, by the way, not intravenous, it's an intramuscular treatment, injected in the muscle mass, they know by radioisotope tracing that these cells will migrate to their target organ within 60 to 90 minutes. So they know they get where they're going. A heart cell injected in your upper outer hip, which is what we use, will be in the heart within 60 to 90 minutes. So they know that. But what it does when it gets there is the interesting thing. It sets up, as embryonic cells do, a more rapid turnover, protein synthesis or biosynthesis of new cells. Cell division is what they're talking about. At about 100% increase over normal for an adult, because a growing child, and certainly an embryo, has a much, much more rapid turnover of cells. So when these are injected, they will migrate to the target organ and set up this more rapid turnover of healthy cells. Now, as we age or have chronic disease, same thing, our cells make mistakes over time. You know the DNA strand, and there are hundreds of thousands of pairs in this DNA strand. Well, every time that cell divides, it makes random mistakes. It can make thousands of random mistakes. Mistakes are caused by ultraviolet radiation. They're caused by diet, oxidation, any number of things. And eventually that cell is still viable, but it is not a young, functioning, healthy cell. I mean, this is what happens to our skin collagen. This is why we look older. This is why we are older. Everything, whether it's disease or healing or if it's aging, it all happens on a cellular level, one cell at a time. As that cell makes 2, makes 4, makes 16, it starts to manifest itself, and you see it as the disease, or you see it as aging, Or on our side of the block, we hope you're seeing it as anti-aging age management. Because the cells that we inject are embryonic. They are perfect in their sequence. When our cells divide and have made these errors, you still have a blueprint. You have the inherent knowledge of the correct genetic code. And when that RNA is out looking for its partner to build the DNA strand, it will prefer the correct code over the incorrect. And that's plug that in, plug another one in, plug another one in, and you have a better cell. And you not only have an improved cell, but you have a cell that's going to duplicate.
I'm sorry to interrupt you,
No, no.
but I thought